6 bridges, one night. And by morning, one of Iran's most important ports was cut off from the rest of the country. Not a radar station, not a patrol boat. Roads, the very roads that move fuel, weapons, and supplies for Iran's military, gone in a matter of hours. And this wasn't random. Analysts watching this conflict closely are calling it the moment the entire strategy changed. Before we get into what actually happened, if you've been sticking with us through this story night after night, do one simple thing for me. Hit subscribe, tap the notification bell, and you'll never miss the next update the moment it lands, because right now this war is genuinely moving day by day. And I always love hearing this. Where in the world are you watching from tonight? Drop your city down in the comments. It's one of my favorite parts of doing this. Now, let's get into what happened, because this is a real shift. Early Friday, July 17th, 2026, the United States expanded its air campaign against Iran in a way it hadn't before. According to reporting from multiple outlets tracking the strikes, American forces hit bridges overnight in Iran's southern Hormuz province, striking the city of Bandar Abbas on the coast near the Strait of Hormuz. Iranian state television reported at least 7 people killed in that specific wave. At least 7 major highway and railway bridges were hit in total, along with a railway junction on the Bandar Abbas line and an airport further east in Iranshar. A port control tower was also reportedly collapsed in the same operation. This wasn't scattered damage, it was a deliberate cut. The bridges targeted carry traffic out of Bandar Abbas, home to the headquarters of Iran's Revolutionary Guard Navy, along the coast and northward toward Shiraz, and from there into the center of the country toward Tehran itself. Think about what that actually means practically. Bandar Abbas isn't just any port. It's arguably the most important logistical artery Iran has for anything moving near the Strait of Hormuz. Weapons move through it. Fuel moves through it. Supplies for the IRGC move through it. Cut the roads and rail lines connecting that port to the rest of the country, and you're not just damaging concrete and steel. You're severing a supply chain. It doesn't matter how many missiles a military has stockpiled if it can't physically move them from where they're stored to where they're needed. This is what some analysts are now describing as a logistics siege. No invasion, no boots on the ground, just the slow, deliberate strangling of a supply network from the air. The local impact was immediate. Hormozgan's provincial administration confirmed that roads leading into Bandar Abbas had been blocked, before later saying traffic had begun moving again slowly and urging residents to avoid non-essential travel. And in a detail that matters more than it might sound, Iran's own energy ministry called on residents across the southern provinces to reduce electricity consumption, citing both extreme heat and, for the first time, publicly acknowledging that the country's power infrastructure had been damaged by the strikes. That's a significant admission. Tehran confirming, in its own words, that the campaign has already started touching the electrical grid, even before any of the larger power plant strikes President Trump has repeatedly threatened. This bridge campaign didn't happen in isolation either. It came directly on the heels of another major escalation just one night earlier. On Tuesday, before any of the bridge strikes began, the U.S. reinstated its full naval blockade around Iran's ports. Ships were told, unambiguously, to stay clear of Iranian oil terminals. Most captains complied. One didn't. According to CENTCOM, the Curaçao-flagged tanker MT Belma, an unladen vessel roughly 100 feet long, ignored multiple warnings and kept moving toward Karg Island, Iran's primary oil export terminal. A U.S. aircraft responded by firing Hellfire missiles directly into the ship's smokestack, disabling it without rupturing its cargo tanks or causing a spill. The tanker made a sharp turn away from Karg Island shortly after being hit, according to vessel tracking data reviewed by Bloomberg. Nobody was harmed, but the message to every other tanker operator watching was unmistakable. Try to slip through the blockade and you will get caught. And then, just one night after that tanker was disabled, the bridge strikes began. 2 separate operations, one at sea, one on land, both aimed at exactly the same goal, cutting Iran off from the resources it needs to keep its military functioning. Iran did not stay quiet in response. In retaliation, Iranian forces launched missiles at neighboring countries hosting American forces: Bahrain, Kuwait, Jordan, and Qatar. A nation that has actually been serving as one of the key mediators trying to broker peace in this war, were all hit. And for the first time in this conflict, one of those strikes crossed into genuinely new territory. A missile damaged a power and water desalination plant inside Kuwait, according to reporting confirmed by multiple outlets. That detail matters enormously. A desalination plant isn't a military target. It's civilian infrastructure that provides clean drinking water to an entire population in a small desert nation that depends on it completely. Hitting one isn't just another military escalation. It's the kind of strike that starts affecting ordinary people who have absolutely nothing to do with this war. So where does that leave us as of this week? A naval blockade, back in force. Bridges, connecting Iran's most important port now in ruins. A desalination plant hit inside an allied Gulf nation, and an Iranian energy ministry publicly admitting for the first time that its power grid has already taken damage. In the next section, we're going to look at just how much this shift has already changed Iran's ability to fight, including a staggering claim from President Trump himself about more than 100 missiles fired at a single American aircraft carrier, and what analysts believe it reveals about where this war goes from here. Let's talk about just how much pressure this two-pronged strategy, blockade at sea, bridges on land, has actually put on Iran's ability to keep fighting, because the numbers here are becoming hard to ignore. Reports circulating this week suggest Iran's daily missile launch rate has dropped sharply compared to just weeks earlier, down to what some trackers describe as only a dozen or so missiles a day. That's a steep fall from the pace Iran was sustaining at points earlier in this conflict. Experts studying the pattern believe this is a direct consequence of the blockade and the bridge strikes working together. If the roads connecting missile storage and production sites to the coast are destroyed, and the ports themselves are locked down by an active naval air blockade, new weapons simply can't reach the places they'd need to be launched from. It's a strategy built on patience rather than a single knockout blow, degrading an opponent's capability one supply route at a time, without a single American soldier setting foot on Iranian soil. And then there's the claim that, if accurate, says a great deal about how effective American missile defense has become in this specific theater. Speaking on the sidelines of the NATO summit in Ankara, Turkey, on July 8th, President Trump told reporters that Iran had fired 111 missiles at the USS Abraham Lincoln, an American aircraft carrier stationed in the region, within roughly a 1-hour window, and that every single one had been intercepted. They didn't hit the ship, Trump said, and you know what would have happened if they did. It's worth being precise here. This account came directly from Trump himself and, according to reporting at the time, hadn't yet been independently confirmed or vetted by the Pentagon. But if the broad strokes hold up, it would represent one of the most significant demonstrations of layered air defense capability in this entire war. And it lines up with a much larger picture. The Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group has been operating in the CENTCOM region since January, backed by Arleigh Burke-class destroyers equipped with their own missile defense systems, and with a second Carrier Strike Group also active nearby. Whether the number was exactly 111 or something close to it, the underlying claim that American naval defenses in this theater are currently stopping essentially everything Iran throws at them is the kind of detail that shapes how confident Washington feels about continuing to escalate. That confidence shows up in troop numbers, too. According to reporting on the region's military buildup, the U.S. now has more than 50,000 troops stationed across the Middle East, a significant jump from the roughly 40,000 that's typically stationed there at any given time across bases in Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Qatar, the UAE, and Kuwait. Recent deployments, including the amphibious assault ship USS Tripoli carrying thousands of additional Marines and F-35 fighters, have pushed this into what's being described as the largest American military buildup in the region since the Iraq War. Officials describe these forces as being on high alert and ready to act if needed. Is that simply a defensive posture protecting existing assets, or preparation for something larger? Nobody in an official capacity is saying for certain, but it's exactly the kind of number that keeps analysts across the region watching closely. Meanwhile, back on the coast, there's a specific location that's come up again and again throughout this campaign: Chabahar Port's control tower. This was the third time American strikes hit that exact same structure, and this time, according to reports, it was reported destroyed entirely. Alongside it, smaller roads connecting nearby towns and villages to the same supply route heading toward the coast were also hit. None of this is being carried out by a single weapon system either. It's a coordinated mix of fighter jets, aerial drones, and warships, all working the same stretch of coastline and the roads feeding into it. That combination, manned aircraft, unmanned drones, and naval assets all watching the same water and the same roads simultaneously, is worth understanding, because it's a big part of why Iran's options keep shrinking. Long-range reconnaissance drones can loiter for hours over a single vessel before any decision to strike is made, covering a stretch of ocean far larger than any single ship or aircraft could watch alone. Some of these platforms are built to operate largely undetected for extended periods, and rather than sinking a target outright, the preferred method increasingly appears to be disabling without destroying, precisely the approach used against the Belma tanker near Karg Island. That distinction carries real diplomatic weight. A disabled ship sends a clear message without creating an international incident. A sunk one, especially involving a third-party flag state, risks becoming exactly that. Put all of that together. A missile rate cut down to a fraction of what it was. A naval blockade actively enforced with real consequences for violators, bridges and rail lines connecting Iran's most important port now in ruins, a control tower destroyed for the third time, and a president publicly discussing carrier-scale missile barrages being intercepted at essentially a 100% rate. And you start to see why analysts are describing this as a turning point rather than just another news cycle. In the next section, we'll look at what's happening beyond the Middle East itself, including developments in Ukraine and elsewhere that some analysts believe may be more connected to this picture than they first appear, and what Iran's underlying long-term goal in all of this might actually be. While Iran's bridges were coming down and tankers were getting disabled in the Gulf, a very different kind of shakeup was happening in a completely different war zone, and the connection between the two is closer than you might expect. In Ukraine, huge protests broke out in Kiev on Thursday, July 16th, after President Volodymyr Zelensky dismissed his defense minister, Mikhailo Fedorov. Fedorov, only 35 years old, had held the post for just 6 months, but in that short window he was widely credited with turbocharging Ukraine's drone warfare program, the same program that helped Ukraine strike deep into Russian territory and disrupt Moscow's energy infrastructure. Hundreds of protesters gathered near Kiev's Ivan Franko National Theater chanting "Shame," with demonstrations spreading to Lviv, Odessa, and Dnipro. Fedorov didn't go quietly either. He publicly criticized Ukraine's top military commander, General Alexander Syrsky, saying decisions were being made based on loyalty, not data, and questioning whether Ukraine could win the war with Syrsky in charge of the army. It's the most public split inside Ukraine's defense leadership since the war with Russia began, and it happened in the same week Ukrainian and Iranian battlefields were both making headlines simultaneously. Here's why that matters for our story specifically. Ukraine hasn't been sitting on the sidelines of the Iran conflict. Earlier this year, after direct U.S. military aid to Ukraine was temporarily suspended, American officials actually asked Kyiv for help defending against Iranian-designed drones, the same Shahed-style drones Iran has long supplied to Russia. Zelensky agreed to send Ukrainian military experts into the Gulf region to help stabilize the situation and support safe navigation efforts, with Fedorov himself describing it as Ukrainian specialists working on the ground to support real practical efforts in the region. In other words, the same man who just got fired amid protests in Kiev was, until recently, one of the people helping coordinate Ukraine's technical support for the broader fight against Iranian-designed weapon systems. Losing a leading figure in drone strategy during an active war, regardless of the internal reasons behind it, is the kind of disruption that ripples outward. And it's exactly the sort of connection analysts mean when they say modern conflicts rarely stay fully separate from one another anymore. Now, back to the core question hanging over everything happening in the Gulf. What is Iran actually trying to achieve here? Publicly, Tehran has framed this entire war as defensive, protecting its sovereignty, resisting outside pressure, standing us up to what it calls foreign aggression. But many analysts watching the pattern of events over the past several weeks believe the real goal is something considerably bigger. Long-term, durable control over the Strait of Hormuz itself, not just wartime control that ends the moment a ceasefire is signed. The numbers explain why that prize is worth fighting for. Roughly 1/5 of the entire world's oil supply moves through this single narrow waterway every single day. A country that could quietly hold leverage over that passage without ever fully closing it outright would gain enormous influence over the global economy simply through the constant threat of disruption. Missiles ready to fire, patrol boats ready to harass shipping, a shadow fleet of unmarked tankers ready to move oil in ways that dodge international sanctions and rules entirely. Analysts have started calling this a toll booth strategy. Iran doesn't need to fully block the strait to gain real power from it. It only needs the rest of the world to believe it could, at any moment, if provoked. That reframes something that happened weeks ago in a completely different light. When Iranian forces attacked commercial vessels, despite an active ceasefire earlier this year, it was initially described by many observers as a miscalculation, an isolated mistake. Looking back now, a growing number of analysts see it differently, as a deliberate test designed to see whether the United States would actually respond with real force or quietly look the other way, to protect a fragile peace deal. Based on everything that's happened since, the naval blockade, 7+ consecutive nights of strikes, command centers destroyed, and now bridges connecting Iran's most important port. Reduced to rubble, the answer to that test looks unmistakably clear. The United States did not look away. For Iran, this likely was not the outcome it was betting on. A strategy built on testing boundaries while staying just under the threshold of full-scale war appears, at least for now, to have badly backfired. Missile output has dropped sharply. Supply routes into its most important port are cut. Its shadow fleet operations are now directly threatened, as shown by the Belma tanker strike near Karg Island. Iran finds itself by nearly every visible measure, in a materially weaker position than it was in just a few weeks ago. And yet, analysts caution against assuming this means the war is close to winding down. Iran's core strategic ambition, long-term influence over the world's most important oil choke point, hasn't changed just because its immediate tools for pursuing it have been degraded. Even from a weakened position, Tehran may keep searching for new pressure points, proxy forces operating across the region, whatever remains of its shadow fleet, or fresh attempts to test the edges of any future ceasefire the way it tested this one. Meanwhile, the American posture looks firm for now, with more than 50,000 troops in the region, 2 active carrier strike groups, and officials treating an open Strait of Hormuz as a non-negotiable priority. This increasingly looks less like a short-term reaction and more like a long-term commitment. In the final section, we'll walk through where analysts believe this realistically goes from here and what the destruction of Iran's bridges specifically tells us about how much further this war still has to run. So let's bring this all together, because after everything we've covered, the bridges cut off outside Bandar Abbas, the tanker disabled near Karg Island, a desalination plant hit inside Kuwait, and a defense shakeup in Kiev that's more connected to this story than it looks. The real question is simple. What does destroying Iran's bridges in a single night actually tell us about where this war is headed? The first thing it tells us is that this conflict has officially moved past the phase of hitting weapons and defenses alone. For weeks, this campaign followed a fairly predictable rhythm. Coastal radar, patrol boats, command centers, missile storage sites. Bridges are a different category of target entirely. They're not weapons. They're not military installations in the traditional sense. They're the physical connective tissue that lets a country function day to day, moving fuel, food, and yes, military supplies, but also just people getting to work and goods getting to market. Once infrastructure like that becomes a normal, repeated target, something changes in the character of a war. It becomes much harder to walk back. You can rebuild trust after a missile exchange. It's much harder to rebuild trust after a country's basic transportation network has been deliberately dismantled piece by piece. That's really the through line connecting everything we've discussed across every section of the story. Command centers hit to break Iran's ability to coordinate. A naval blockade reimposed to choke off what moves by sea. Bridges destroyed to choke off what moves by land. A desalination plant damaged inside an allied nation as retaliation. Each of these on its own might look like an isolated headline. Together, they form a single coherent pattern, a war that has expanded from targeting an enemy's weapons to targeting the systems that keep an entire country, and increasingly its neighbors, running. So where does this realistically go from here? Analysts studying the pattern generally point to a few plausible paths, and it's worth being honest that none of them are guaranteed. The first is a slow, grinding de-escalation, or sustained pressure. The blockade, the missile rate reportedly dropping to a fraction of what it was, the bridge is gone, eventually forces Iran back to a negotiating table, but from a considerably weaker position than it held even a month ago. Given that Iran's own energy ministry has now publicly acknowledged damage to its power grid for the first time, and that Hormozgan's provincial government has confirmed real disruption to road access around Bandar Abbas, there's at least some evidence this pressure is landing exactly where it's meant to. The second path is a prolonged standoff. Neither side fully backing down, both sides settling into a long, tense rhythm of limited strikes and limited responses, without a clear resolution on the horizon, given how many consecutive nights of strikes we're already at. And given that Iran's foreign ministry has continued insisting there are no active plans for negotiation, even as its own energy minister admits real damage, this path currently looks at least as plausible as any full breakthrough. The third, and the one that should concern anyone watching this closely, is further escalation. Infrastructure. Attacks continuing to expand on both sides, drawing in more countries and creating more civilian consequences, the exact pattern already visible in the strike on Kuwait's desalination plant. Once civilian infrastructure becomes a shared mutual target rather than an occasional accident, the risk isn't just that the war continues, it's that it becomes genuinely harder for either side to find an off-ramp, because both sides now have real domestic pressure to keep responding in kind. What's clear, regardless of which of these paths plays out, is that this conflict has permanently changed shape over the past week. It's no longer only a story about missiles, radar systems, and military bases. It has become a fight over supply lines, energy infrastructure, and long-term control of one of the most consequential waterways on the planet. A fight where roughly 1/5 of the world's oil supply hangs in the balance every single day this continues. And whichever side ends up holding real leverage over the Strait of Hormuz, once this eventually settles, may carry influence over the global economy for years afterward, long after the last bridge gets rebuilt. We're going to keep tracking this story exactly as closely as we have been, night by night, because based on the pace of the last week, command centers one night, a blockade the next, bridges the night after that. There's no reason to think the pace slows down anytime soon. If you want to be here for whatever comes next, hit subscribe, turn on the bell, and you won't miss it. And I'd genuinely like to know what you think. Does cutting off Bandar Abbas's bridges actually bring Iran closer to the table? Or does it just push both sides further into a war neither one seems ready to end? Tell me your take in the comments. Let me know where in the world you're watching from tonight, and I'll see you in the next one.